Hello, neuroscientists. Today, we are going to learn all about the neuron. You're going to draw a diagram of the neuron and summarize what the parts do, and then you're going to build a model of the neuron to show your understanding. So let's get started. There is a handout in the description of this video that you can print and use to do your diagram, or you can just do it on paper if you don't have a way to print it, and that will work just fine. So this is my diagram of a neuron. You should color code yours, but you can use different colors than I have used, as long as you differentiate between the parts. When we talk about the neuron, there is a start and there is an end to the neuron, and I'm going to begin at the first part of the neuron, which is this. I've done it in green. This is called the dendrites of the neuron. And dendra comes from the word root meaning tree, and you can see this is branchy like trees. The dendrites are the part of the neuron that pick up the signals from receptor cells in your sensory organs or from other neurons. Here is my model of a neuron, and hopefully you can tell in my model right away what the dendrites are. I have modeled the dendrites with these little leaves from my geranium. So when you make your model, you'll also come up with a way to model the dendrites. What the dendrites do, like I said, is to receive signals, and they send those signals to the next part of our neuron, which is called the soma, or the cell body. If we look at my diagram, the soma is in orange. Inside of it is the nucleus, which contains the DNA. Now look at my model of the neuron. I have represented the soma in red, so it's sort of three-dimensional, and the nucleus is represented right here by this little ball. So the nucleus is embedded down in the soma. So are other organelles like ribosomes. This is where the proteins are made. So the DNA codes for the proteins. This is basically like the brain of the cell. So the signals come in from the dendrites and they go to the soma, and the soma acts like the control center and determines what happens next. In my notes, I included that this is where the nucleus is. It's where proteins are made, and it is the control center, similar to a brain. The next thing that we're going to look at is this big long part of the neuron. This can actually be more than a foot long, and this is called the axon. If you look at my model, the axon is represented by this metal stick. This is a skewer that I use to make shish kebabs. So the axon is this long, thin metal stick, and you can see there are some things on top of it. It is the longest part by far. And what the axon does is it's like a wire. It carries an electrical signal just like a wire does. And it carries it very, very quickly from the beginning of the neuron to the end of the neuron. So what I put in my notes is that it's long, it's like a wire, and it carries the signal quickly. The next thing that I want to talk about is the purple that is all around. You can see like these little spheres around the axon. And this is actually a coating on the axon called myelin. If you look at my model, I have represented the myelin with tape. The myelin wraps around the axon, but there are gaps between where the myelin is. This is also known as the myelin sheath, and sheath is another word for coating. So all this tape represents myelin. The myelin sheath is fatty. It's a coating on the axon, and just like wires need to have a coating on them, the axon needs to have a coating to increase its ability to transmit a signal quickly. So this insulates the axon so the signal can move more quickly. But where does the myelin come from? Well, that brings us to the little darker dots that you can see in my drawing. These are called the Schwann cells. If you look at my model, the Schwann cells are represented by little black beans, and they're actually underneath the tape. They're embedded in it, and that's because the Schwann cells make the myelin, but then they're also stuck in that myelin that they made. In my notes, I made a note that they are also known as Neurolemma, and they make myelin, and then they're embedded in the myelin. So they're separate little cells. Okay, the next thing that I want to focus on are these little gaps. They're the parts of the axon where there is no myelin, and these are known as the nodes of Ranvier. They are named for the person who discovered them. When we look at my model, the nodes of Ranvier are the places where we can see the axon where there's no myelin covering it up. So you have little nodes all along the axon. The reason for the nodes of Ranvier is you have to have little areas that aren't covered in myelin sheath so that there's some ability for ions to move in and out of the cell. Because wherever the myelin sheath is, it's impermeable. So this is the only area where there's permeability, and ions like sodium and potassium can flow in and out. And that's going to be really important when we learn about action potentials. Next, we reach the end of the axon where it starts to branch. And the parts where the axon starts to branch are known as the axon terminals. Terminal means ending. So if we say a disease is terminal, we mean that you're not going to recover. It's the end of your life. In my model, I have represented the axon terminal with these sucker sticks. So you can see the axons branching. Axon terminal is the branching end of an axon. And these branch toward the next neuron. So where each neuron ends, there is another neuron connected to it. Or if it's a motor neuron, these axon terminals would end in the muscle and make the muscle contract. The axon terminal ends in these little terminal buttons, and they are at the very end. I've represented the terminal buttons with lollipops. So the candy part is the terminal button. Terminal buttons are the ends of the axon, and they store something called neurotransmitters, which are chemicals. The neurotransmitters are what lets the signal jump from this neuron to the next neuron, or in the case of a motor neuron, from this neuron into the muscle to make the muscle contract. Okay, so you have seen my model of a neuron from start to finish, and now it is your turn to make your own model of a neuron. Use simple materials that you have around the house. I did not buy anything for this. I just went around and found some things I could use. The important thing is to really be able to explain what each thing represents. You could even go outside. I thought about using a stick with some branches and leaves, for example. So you could go make something big outside, but make sure you can explain your neuron and show that you really understand it. And remember to start at the beginning and end at the end. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.